college football looks much different than it did 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. I think we can all agree on that, but I don't think anybody had on their bingo card the fact that recruiting was going away. We aren't going to be doing recruiting anymore. Shocking. I know. I was just as shocked. And we're talking about it today on Locked On Cyclones.
You are Locked On Cyclones, your daily podcast on the Iowa State Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shout out to you for being here every single day and making this your first watch or listen of the day. I appreciate it more than you know, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your favorite podcasting platform. Be sure to hit subscribe so we can prove once and for all that it is, in fact, a Cyclone state. Today, we are breaking down more Media Day coverage, just oodles and oodles of things to cover when all of the basically everyone gets on a mic for college football. I know it's not literally everyone, but there's a lot to cover. So first thing we're going to go over, apparently recruiting is dead. That is a literal quote from the reigning conference champions. So it's not just from nobody. Kind of a wild quote. We'll start there. Then we're going into a new non-conference plan that could actually be very, very good. We'll talk about that in the second segment. And then finally, we're going to address the Big 12 cannibalism because it has been talked about a lot the last 2 days. We're going to dive into all of that. And honestly, we'll see. I might end up off track because there is so much going on around this sport. But let's start with Kenny Dillingham's quote saying that, quote, "To me, recruiting is dead. Retention is alive." I understand where he's coming from here, but that's a pretty strong statement. He also goes on to say here, it's not about recruiting. I don't care if we're ranked dead last in recruiting my entire career here. Who knows? It'd be like if the draft was for 1 year, then half of your draft picks leave. So it's all about retention now. That's my entire thing. That's doubling down essentially on the fact that like he's just not worried about recruiting. He's just literally not. And I have a couple of thoughts on this, and obviously we're going to tie this back to Iowa State because this is Locked On Cyclones. But I can see where he's coming from to a degree. However, I do wonder how are you going to get guys worth retaining in your building? I guess it's kind of like if you build it, they will come. Is that what he's kind of going for here? But that's in Iowa, not in Arizona, to my knowledge. Granted, it's been a while. But anyways, I don't think he's that far off base by saying that recruiting is dead and retention is alive, because I think half of that statement is entirely true. Retention is where you make your money nowadays. And I do think that Iowa State has one of the better retention programs across the country. And it's another thing, too, when Campbell was talking about there was 20 or so guys that definitely could have gotten paid more had they gone elsewhere, and they chose to stay with Iowa State. Now, a lot of people saying they essentially took a pay cut. That's not really the case. If you compare them to maybe taking more money, I suppose that's a pay cut, but I'm sure they're making more this year than they were last year. So is that really a pay cut? I see where they're coming from by saying that, but it's not really taking less money than they did last year. It's taking less money than they could have, I suppose, which is kind of in some ways a pay cut. But the point is, multiple guys, not just Rocco Becht, chose to stay with Iowa State because, well, there's a ton of different reasons. You know, it could be because of Matt Campbell. It could be because of their position coach. It could be because of obviously the teammates. It could be because of the campus, the university, the quality of their education. Could be because of the meals that they're getting at Iowa State. Could be the other success of any other program, any other sports athletics program in the university, men's basketball, women's basketball, gymnastics, softball, whatever. There's so many different reasons it could be for, but I think that the culture at Iowa State is second to none. And it's the phrase that always pops right in my head when we start talking about culture. And so to circle back to Coach Dillingham's comment that recruiting is dead, that part I don't necessarily agree with, because if your retention is at 100%, hypothetically speaking, like, then the argument that the first round draft picks are all cut or whatever it was, uh, it doesn't, or they all become free agents or whatever, it doesn't hold much weight if your retention is as good as it could be. Essentially, if your recruiting is very, very good, but your retention is very, very bad, this makes complete sense. Recruiting is absolutely dead. I agree with you 1000%. There's literally no reason to recruit young players to your school unless they're going to play that year, because they're going to leave. So why even bother recruiting? And I am acting under the assumption he's talking about recruiting high school players. Recruiting in the transfer portal is also very important. I just I'm very confused by his concept of not doing any recruiting at all. So I'm choosing without having more context to assume that he means high school players. So if you're recruiting all these high school guys and your retention is zero, if they don't play as freshmen, they don't play for your program. And then in that case, it does make sense. Recruiting is dead. However, if your retention is very good, if you recruit well, those guys will stay on the team for a long time or for their whole career. So that part I disagree with, in the fact of, if you can level up your retention, recruiting is still very valid. And that's where I think Iowa State's at. I think Iowa State's recruiting is very valid. We're seeing an upswing for sure. Yeah, I know we didn't get Jet Tamala. Who knows? Maybe he'll end up coming back to Iowa State. No, not at Alabama for very long. Who knows? But I think aside from that, you look at this year's class, you look at next year's class, you look at the transfer portal, the moves that were made. I'm very impressed, and I think it's a sign of big things to come. It shows where Iowa State is trending towards. You can see recruiting very solid, right? The other piece, the key piece, if you will, as I was just talking about in my analogy or breakdown, I suppose, is the retention. And I think Iowa State's retention is very good. So Iowa State has very good retention, as I was talking about. And then because of the very good recruiting, now they find themselves in this kind of powerhouse of a situation. You're not lacking on recruiting, so you're holding on to these 1 stars, and you're not lacking on retention, so you're bringing in 5 stars, but they're leaving right away. So they're essentially not really on the team unless they were to play some snaps. You've got kind of the best of both worlds at Iowa State, which I think sets them apart from definitely some schools across the nation. I think the Big 12 as a whole is relatively pretty good about both of these categories. So definitely at least in the upper tier in the Big 12. And I think that sets them up for long-term success. Now, granted, the money side of things, something we are definitely going to talk about over the probably next week, but the next few days or so, because they talked a lot about that at media days. And that's an area that Iowa State could potentially struggle in. But for the most part, retention and recruiting, I think Iowa State is killing it, doing very, very good work, and proving that recruiting isn't dead. I love you, Kenny Dillingham, to an extent. Obviously, don't love what happened last year, but I do like the way that you run your program. But I don't know if I can fully get behind the recruiting is dead mentality, because if your retention is high, you can recruit great players and retain them. And that's what I think Iowa State is doing. Now, the question is, with those retained players, can that lead to college football playoff appearances? Well, there's a change to the non-conference schedule that could potentially, maybe someday, happen that would lead to more college football playoff appearances, in my opinion, for the Big 12. And we're talking about that coming up right here after this. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little bit more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with daily new promotions and fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must watch events. If you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit fanduel.com to get started. So there were 8 Big 12 coaches jumping on the bed. One fell off, and what do they say? I forget how that song goes. I don't know if I've heard that in 20 years. The point is, you're here with Locked On Cyclones, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're breaking down some more comments from Big 12 Media Days, and Coach Sataki of BYU threw out kind of offhand, maybe one of the best ideas I've heard up until this point. There's a lot of like, well, I'd love to see this. I'd love to see this. I'd love to see this. And Prime yesterday was very much more outspoken than the rest, I would say, or at least in some regards. He at least made it seem like he was more outspoken when he literally said, everyone else here is thinking it. I'm just going to say it. And so, Prime certainly had some bold takes, and it was really easy to tell when he was saying something that was like, this is what's needs to be done. But a lot of the time it was like, well, we kind of feel this way, we feel that way, whatever ish. But Sataki threw this out, and I was like, that was so offhand, yet also so good. We should visit that. We should talk about that. And after I get done breaking it down, if you've seen it already, or if at the end of the breakdown, let me know on Twitter at Nick_Marv what you think, because I think this could be a big deal. Sataki proposed that with the 3 non-conference games that the Big 12 teams have, why not just play all of the other Power 4 conferences? Well, there's a reason he's coaching BYU and I'm sitting here in my parents' house. Like, that's a brilliant idea. That's a super good idea. Now, what does that do? For one thing, it starts to level out the general strength of schedule across the board. Now, if every conference were to do this, all these top Power 4 conferences, that would start to level it out just a little bit more. The question in my eyes, or the first question that I would have, is how do you end up with your opponents? Because when you look at like the NFL scheduling, you're playing an interconference division, the other conference, another division from there, you're facing, I think it's like all of the other opposing conferences, divisional, ranked at the same position you were last season, besides the folk division you're playing. Very bad at explaining it on the back of a napkin here. But my point is, it's very methodical who teams play in the NFL. I know for a fact that every 8 years, New England will be in Chicago unless something wild changes, or they get them on a random year. Just because of the way that it works. They'll play the NFC North every 4 years, and they'll face every 4 years that'll switch where they'll play, for example, Green Bay and Chicago at home. And then the next time they play the division, they'll play the Lions and the Vikings at home. We understand how that works. How does that translate over to college football? Does Iowa State, the SEC school they play, they just happen to get Alabama every single year? Big question mark there. Until Alabama takes a big dip in production, I'm not sure that that's exactly the best. I mean, obviously, Iowa State would win every single time, and that would look great. But if they were to slip up, probably not ideal. Kind of had to be perfect in that situation. Nonetheless, my point is, how would that be regulated? That was my first question. But once you get past that, if you're able to figure it out to some degree, I think that this makes the most sense for leveling out the playing field as far as strength of schedule goes. To a degree, yes, but you won't see as much of FCS schools getting upsets and weird. How do you rank that? How do you even go about that? It just smooths out the entire playing field significantly. And then it also kind of pits the conferences against one another. I especially like the fact that it's early in the season, as opposed to at the end of the year when everyone's already beat up. And yes, it will happen in the playoffs, but it's like fresh, just everyone's 100% ready to go, and you get to see an SEC Big Ten battle, or you get to see a Big 12 ACC battle, or a Big 12 SEC battle. And it's not to say that this stuff has never happened. That's not the case, I don't think, at least. But that this would happen every single year, and it would kind of create this level of data of, this is basically what happens every single year. I think that'd be really neat, just maybe from the nerd side of me, that looking at that data in comparison of, how has the SEC performed against the Big 12 at the beginning of the season, and then how has the conference as a whole performed against itself, and then maybe in the postseason as well. Like, there would be all of this data that I think would be just fascinating, but maybe that's just me. Uh, from a perspective of the Big 12 and Iowa State, I think that this would be beneficial because I do think that the Big 12 as a whole is deeper than the SEC. And it's something that we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes when we get to segment 3. But I think that that's going, if this were to happen, you would see I think, a very strong winning percentage from the Big 12 across the other conferences. I think they'd probably go practically undefeated against the ACC, maybe lose 2 to 3 games against the Big 10, maybe lose 2 to 3 games against the SEC, whatever. But across the board, very strong showing from the Big 12. And what does that mean? Well, that results in the perception of the voting skewing towards the Big 12, towards the better conference, right? As opposed to a situation where, well, we feel like the SEC is better because, well, they play conference games and they just they just take it to each other every single week, man. Hypothetically speaking, like, we don't know. We just don't, like, we have data now in this scenario where the Big 12 dominated the SEC. So probably the Big 12, if you're going to match them up with an SEC school, you've got a lot more who faced who, faced who, faced who. How does this play out? What's the actual win percentage of, it just gives you a lot more data to be able to at least more accurately rank these teams. Now, is it going to be perfect? No. Could the SEC blow the Big 12 out of the water? I suppose there are some years where, the SEC was oddly good at basketball last season. So it's not to say that it can't happen. I'm not saying that this is like the ticket to the Big 12, getting in the college football playoff. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think it would help I just have this general idea that there is a perception against the Big 12 when it comes to the rankings. It seems like, Alabama and Georgia that start at like the 1-2 kind of before the season, they kind of have to really work hard to drop outside the top 10 versus like Iowa State that might be starting at like 22. If they go undefeated, what is their max? Unless they like literally blow out every team by 95 points and they don't commit a single turnover and like they just show everything on paper. What is their ceiling? Because, well, they never played an SEC school because they played Iowa, I guess. So that would be a Big 10 school, but no SEC schools. Okay. So they're just ranked higher because they started higher, essentially. Okay. See, that's what I'm talking about. It makes it really tough. If this were to happen, hypothetically, I think it would really open the door to make the rankings almost more fair, more realistic, more legitimate. Definitely have a little bit more credibility, in my opinion. If you agree, let me know. And @1_Marv or on Twitter or in the comments down below. If you disagree, also let me know, because I'm just curious. Like, why would that be incorrect? I feel like that would be the smart play for all the teams and for the sport as a whole. Now, we can move on from that concept, but we're not moving away from the Big 12 as a whole, because there was a lot of talk about Big 12 cannibalism, and we got to talk about Iowa State's kind of position in this whole thing coming up right after this. Iowa State in the Big 12, last I checked. And last I checked was about 20 minutes ago. So welcome to you guys. Make it to the third segment. Big thank you, I suppose. Maybe not. I don't really know what the best way to say that is. My point is, we're in segment 3, and we're going to talk about some Big 12 cannibalism today on Locked On Cyclones, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. There was a lot of talk about how deep the Big 12 is across the board at Big 12 Media Days, which is definitely the place that makes sense that this kind of conversation would happen. But I think that there was this general running theme of like any one of these teams could win the conference. Any given week, you need to bring your A game. You can't bring your B or your C game. Any given week, anyone can win anywhere. And I'm saying it with like that tone, but I'm that's not the way I want it to come out. I agree with literally every single one of those comments. I'm not saying that that's incorrect. I'm just saying that that's kind of the general sentiment that was had. And so I wanted to talk about it because I do think that the Big 12 being so deep in a lot of ways hurts itself more than it helps itself because you don't generally have a dominant force, and especially year to year, you definitely don't have a dominant force. But when you're missing that kind of top end talent to really separate the conference and say this is the best of the Big 12, like they are undefeated, they dominate every game. It really makes it hard for committees and or other persons to pin down what is the max of the Big 12. In a world where Iowa State goes 10-2, I think it's pretty clear that they lose to two very good teams. Right? We've kind of broken down Iowa State's schedule. In a world where Iowa State goes 8-4 or 9-3, there's a very real chance that they lose to two very good teams and they just kind of drop one along the way. Not because that they didn't show up, which is definitely what you would hear from Matt Campbell and company, but maybe more so because all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, Arizona, that's been like in this hypothetical scenario, and I'm going to go based on the Big 12 preseason poll here, Arizona coming in at 16. Arizona just literally doesn't drop a pass, and everyone is constantly like breaking tack. Like they just have this weirdly on game because that could happen. And it's kind of like what we saw last year from Kansas. And so then it's like, how do you judge Iowa State now if they have two losses at this point in the season, let's say, one to Arizona State and one to Arizona. And this is a completely made up scenario. This is not really going to happen. I don't even think Iowa State plays Arizona. I don't have it up in front of me. 99.9% sure. Point is, it's kind of like Notre Dame last year against the loss to NIU, Northern Illinois. But I didn't love that either because you were looking at Northern Illinois and their victory over Notre Dame, but then also Boise State and their near loss to Oregon, both like being in the same week. It was like this whole weird, like it made it so difficult to rank those. But the point is, how do you rank that? How do you rank an Iowa State team that maybe beat a very good team earlier in the year? Maybe let's say like BYU, who we don't know what's going to happen at quarterback. So maybe they're very, very good. And Iowa State beats them by 10 points, 2 possessions. Then they go and play Arizona State and they lose. They win a couple in the middle and they lose to Arizona. How do you rank that? That's just what the Big 12 is. You never know who's going to turn it on any given Saturday. I think across the board, this is probably the deepest or at least the most condensed conference. I don't think you have like the super top end and then down here way at the bottom, put it right here. down here way at the bottom like gap. I think it's more like here's your top, here's your bottom. Like there is definitely a gap. And then even inside the bottom, you get up into here, and now it's like there's only 3 teams in kind of this bottom half. This top half is like loaded. Like any given game, it could be you're gonna have teams that are at the top of this. They are technically better, probably, than these bottom-ish, middle-ish teams, but those teams can still win. And so I guess I don't really have a great like plan of action for this. Like this is just kind of what it is. But we've got to find a way to somehow make it measurable. Is it the 3 non-conference games being against other conferences to show that the Big 12 is better across the board, as far as win percentages from the top, middle, and bottom of the Big 12 against other conferences? And how did those teams perform in their respective conferences? Is that the best way to rank out how good the Big 12 is? Is it the best? What's the next best option? Unfortunately, I don't have Kalani Sitake type of vibes going on in my brain where I can just whip up some of the best ideas ever. It's just kind of like I don't have the best answer for you. Other than maybe just we shouldn't pre-rank every. Gosh, who was it that was talking about it at the roundtable? It might have been Kleiman, maybe that was talking about we shouldn't really have a preseason poll because it made it difficult for like Arizona State and BYU last year versus like teams that start out at ranked 3rd and they're allowed to go 1-4 to start the season. They're still in the top 25 or still in the top 15 because everyone's like justifying their reasoning for ranking them high. Like maybe it is just not ranking anyone till week 10. I know that takes away from like some of the media, some of the angles, some of the narratives of building up this game of, oh, we've got 1-2 in town for college game day or big noon kickoff, and this is gonna be the matchup of the century. Like I get it, you're missing that if you don't rank until week 8. But then also at that point, you've got a couple games under your belt where now you can rank more accordingly, as opposed to, well, we did say Georgia was in the top 3 to start this year. They have 3 losses, yeah, but we definitely can't let them go below like 9. We would look ridiculous. So maybe that's the answer. I think that there has to be a way, and maybe it's Brett Yormark that has to do this. I don't know who needs to lobby for these changes, but there has to be a way for the Big 12 to show that it is just really good across the board at beating itself up. It's not so much that everyone stinks and there's inconsistency. It's that everyone's good. And if you slip up a little bit, you open up a window where a team could just open up the floodgates. And I don't know who needs to make those like, hey, let's do this type of deals. But I think it would help the Big 12. I really do. Let me know what you think in the comments down below or at Nick_Marv on Twitter. And I can't wait tomorrow for Armageddon Friday. Yeah, this is going to be a doozy. Stick around for that one. If you haven't already, hit subscribe down below. It is completely free, and it helps prove that it is, in fact, a Cyclone state. With that being said, until next time, Cyclone fans, sayonara.